The Bounty on the Brides by Janson Davies. Chapter 1. Dust and Deceit. The sun was a cruel overseer, hanging high and hot over the western plains. It bleached the sky to a pale, merciless blue and burned the clouds into shapeless puffs of gray. Dust rose in lazy spirals behind the lone rider and his dog. The pair cut a slow path through the brittle grass and sun-baked earth. Trace Ridgway rode with the posture of a man born to the saddle, with a cavalry trooper's pride and precision. His faded blue slouch hat, with its frayed gold cord, was pulled low, casting a shadow over eyes that had seen too much and said too little. A rifle rested across his back, worn smooth at the grip. His dusty blue coat had bare patches above each shoulder where epaulets and a captain's bars had once sat. His face was unshaven, and his boots were dusty, but his presence was unmistakable, steady, deliberate, and watchful. A man used to command. Beside him trotted Pete, a blue heeler with a coat like storm clouds and eyes that didn't match. One amber, one ice blue. Pete's nose twitched constantly, reading the land like a book. He was lean, fast, and smarter than most men Trace had met. Together they were a familiar sight in these parts, though not always a welcome one. Trace didn't wear a star. He wasn't a lawman. He wasn't a bounty hunter in the traditional sense. He didn't chase bank robbers or stagecoach bandits. His quarry was stranger, more elusive, runaway brides. It was a peculiar line of work, born of desperation and an empty stomach. The men who hired him were miners, ranchers, railroad workers, lonely souls who'd sent for wives from back east, only to be left with empty beds and lighter pockets. Some women vanished before the wedding. Others waited until the ink on the marriage license was dry. They took money, horses, sometimes even the family Bible, and then they were gone. Trace didn't judge. He'd known loss, too. A schoolteacher named Becky, taken by fever before they could marry. He still carried her photograph in his coat, the edges worn soft by time and touch. This latest trail led from a mining camp near Dead Horse Gulch. A man named Amos had written in shaky script, "She took my gold, my mule, and my heart. Please, Mr. Ridgway, bring her back, or at least the first two." Trace had read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and tucked it into his saddlebag. Pete had watched him with that knowing look, tail thumping once against the dirt. Now, 3 days into the trail, they were closing in. Pete had caught the scent near a dry creek bed, where a woman's boot print mingled with mule tracks. Trace dismounted, crouched low, and studied the ground. "She's riding hard," he murmured, "but not smart." Pete sniffed the air, then barked once, sharp and certain. Trace stood, dusted off his knees, and swung back into the saddle. "Let's go, partner." They rode until the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and blood red. In the distance, a flicker of smoke curled upward, a campfire maybe. Trace slowed his horse and signaled Pete forward. The dog loped ahead, silent as a shadow. Minutes later, Pete returned, tail stiff, ears alert. Trace nodded. "Let's pay her a visit." They approached on foot, moving through the brush with practiced ease. The woman sat by the fire, her back to them, humming a tune Trace didn't recognize. A mule grazed nearby, tethered to a scrub pine. Trace stepped into the firelight. "Evening, ma'am." She didn't startle, just turned slowly, revealing a face lined with dust and defiance. "Took you long enough," she said. "You got anything to eat?" Chapter 2. Men of the West. The frontier was a land of men, grizzled, sunburnt, and starved for softness. They came west chasing gold, land, or the promise of something better. What they found was wind, work, and silence. The kind of silence that settled in your bones and made you talk to your horse just to hear a voice. In the camps and towns that dotted the plains, men gathered around fires and talked about women they'd never met. They passed around catalogs and letters, pooling coins for train fares and wedding dresses. Some wrote poetry. Others just scrawled, "I need a wife," and hoped for the best. The mail-order bride business boomed. Agencies back east promised matches made in heaven. But heaven was a long way from the Dakota territory. Some women came with hope in their hearts. Others came with schemes. Trace had seen both. He'd seen the joy of a wedding under prairie skies, the awkward dances, the shy smiles. He'd also seen the aftermath of betrayal, men staring into campfires, clutching empty rings and bottles of whiskey. Pete had a nose for sorrow. He'd nudged the grieving man's hand, sat beside him until the worst passed. Trace never said much. He didn't have to. One night, in a saloon outside Cheyenne, a man named Luther told Trace his story. His bride had left in the night, taking his horse and his mother's locket. "I don't even want her back," Luther said. "Just the locket. That's all I got left of Ma." Trace nodded. "I'll find her." He did. 3 towns over, singing in a traveling show. She gave back the locket without a fight. She said she was tired of being someone's property, Trace told Luther later. Didn't say she was sorry. Luther stared at the locket in his palm. "Don't reckon she had to." Chapter 3. The First Bounty. Trace's reputation was made on the case of Silas Duffy, a grizzled miner with a beard like tumbleweed and a voice like gravel. Silas had sent for a bride named Kate, a widow from St. Louis. She arrived with a trunk full of lace and perfume, married Silas in a dusty chapel, and vanished 2 weeks later with his gold and his borrowed horse. "She was too pretty for me," Silas admitted. "Should have known." Trace took the job. Pete found the trail near a dry riverbed where Kate had dropped a silk glove. They followed her to a saloon in a town called Whiskey Bend. The place was loud, full of smoke and piano music. Kate was on stage singing a song about distant oceans and city lights. She wore a red dress and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Trace waited until the show ended. Pete lay under the piano, ears twitching. When she stepped off the stage, Trace approached. "Ma'am," he said, "I've come to bring you home, or at least bring back what you took." She didn't flinch, just looked at him with tired eyes. "I was never meant for gold pans and mule trails," she said. She handed over the money. Pete nudged her hand gently. Trace didn't take her back to Silas, just returned the gold and the horse. "She said she'd rather die than go back," he told Silas. Silas nodded. "Can't blame her." That was the day the legend began. Man and dog, fair but firm. With the legend came the demand. Trace learned to pace himself after riding off and recovering 6 troublesome brides for 6 moronic brothers. There had originally been 7 brides, but he let the eldest one go and freed her from her lifelong misery. She had only agreed to the marriage to watch over her sisters, who were a pack of flighty schemers. They and their husbands deserved each other. Since then, Trace only worked on one assignment at a time, one bride at a time, and he was particular on which tasks to accept. Chapter 4. Letters and Lies. The letters came in bundles, some folded with care, others crumpled and stained with whiskey or tears. Trace kept them in a leather pouch tied to his saddle, each one a story waiting to be weighed. He read them by firelight, Pete curled beside him, the dog's breath slow and steady in the hush of the plains. Some letters were desperate. "She said she loved me. I gave her everything. Please, Mr. Ridgway, find her." Some were angry. "She's a thief and a liar. I want my money and I want her to pay." And some were something else entirely. "I don't blame her. I just want to know she's safe." Trace read each one twice. He didn't take every job. Some women had good reason to run. Some men didn't deserve to be married. Pete seemed to know which was which. He'd growl at the wrong ones, wag for the rest. One letter came from a preacher in Kansas. His bride had vanished the night before their wedding, leaving behind a note. "I'm sorry. I can't be what you need." Trace found her working in a boarding house kitchen 2 towns over. She wore a plain dress and a look of quiet resolve. "I didn't steal anything," she said. "Just my own freedom." Trace nodded. "He's not angry, just worried." She hesitated, then handed him a letter. "Give him this. Tell him I'm all right." Pete sat beside her, tail thumping once. Trace delivered the letter. The preacher read it in silence, then folded it carefully and placed it in his Bible. "Thank you," he said. "That's enough." Not every job ended in confrontation. Some ended in understanding. But there were others, darker ones. A letter from a man in Wyoming spoke of bruises hidden beneath wedding lace, and of more yet to come. Trace didn't take that job. He burned the letter instead. Pete watched the flames, ears low. Chapter 5. The Case of the Railroad Bride. The letter from Jebediah Ross arrived in a battered envelope, sealed with wax and desperation. Jeb was a railroad foreman, a man of iron and smoke. His bride, Abigail, had vanished with his savings and a silver pocket watch passed down from his father. "She said she was going to the general store," the letter read. "She never came back." Trace and Pete followed the trail to a boomtown called Iron Hook, where the tracks met the river and the saloons never closed. The town smelled of sweat and ambition. Men shouted over the clang of hammers, and women moved through the streets like ghosts in corsets and calico. They found Abigail in a makeshift dress shop, stitching hems with quick fingers and a distant look in her eyes. She didn't run when she saw them, just set down her needle and waited. "I suppose Jeb sent you," she said. Trace nodded. "He wants his watch. And his money." She sighed. "He never wanted me. Just someone to cook and keep quiet." Trace didn't answer. He looked around the shop. Threadbare curtains, a cot in the corner, a chipped teacup on the windowsill. "You've made a life here," he said. "I've made a corner," she replied. "That's all a woman gets out here." Pete padded forward, sniffed her hand, then sat beside her. Trace took the watch and half the money. "You can stay," he said, "but if Jeb comes, tell him Ridgway set you free." Abigail smiled for the first time. "Thank you." Word of Trace's compassion spread. Some called him soft, others called him wise. Pete didn't care what they called him. He just wagged his tail and moved on. Chapter 6. Shadows at High Noon. Not every case ended with a handshake and a second chance. Some ended in blood. Red Bluff was a border town with a reputation for trouble. The saloons were louder, the whiskey cheaper, and the lawmen fewer. Trace had been there before, once to track a horse thief, once to bury a friend. This time he came for a woman named Josephine Sawyer, who'd run off with a gambler named Red Jack. Together they'd robbed 3 towns blind, posing as newlyweds, charming their way into homes, then vanishing with jewelry, cash, and sometimes the family dog. Trace and Pete arrived at high noon. The sun was a white ball in a cloudless sky. The streets were empty, shutters drawn. Everyone knew what was coming. Red Jack waited outside the saloon, thumbs hooked in his belt, a smirk on his face. Josephine stood behind him, her dress dusty, her eyes unreadable. "Well, if it ain't the bride catcher," Red Jack drawled. "Come to ruin our honeymoon." Trace didn't answer. Pete growled low. Red Jack went for his gun. Trace was faster. The shot echoed down the street. Red Jack crumpled, his smirk gone. Josephine didn't scream. She just knelt beside the dead man, touched his face, then emptied his pockets. She stood and faced Trace. "I didn't want this," she said. Trace holstered his gun. "Then why run away with him?" She looked away. "Because he asked." Trace took the stolen money and escorted her to a stagecoach heading east. "Start over," he said. Pete watched her go, ears twitching. Later, Trace sat on the saloon steps, cleaning his pistol. Pete lay beside him, head on his paws. "Some people," Trace said, "just need a second chance." Pete thumped his tail once. Chapter 7. The Cost of Loneliness. The prairie had a way of wearing a man down, not with violence, but with silence. It wasn't the gunfights or the long rides that aged Trace Ridgway. It was the quiet, the kind that settled in your bones and made you forget the sound of laughter. Trace and Pete rode through a valley of wind-carved stone, the sky above them wide and empty. They were heading to a town called Mercy's End, where a man named Elijah Boone had written a letter soaked in grief. "She left me," it read. "Took the money I saved for our homestead. I don't want revenge. I just want to know why." Trace found Elijah sitting outside a half-built cabin, hammer still in hand, though he hadn't driven a nail in days. The man looked hollowed out, like a tree struck by lightning. "She was kind," Elijah said. "At first, then she got quiet, then she was gone." Trace nodded. "That happens." Elijah looked up. "You ever been left?" Trace didn't answer. Pete sat beside the man, resting his head on Elijah's boot. Trace found the woman 2 towns over, working in a bakery. She didn't run. She didn't cry. "I couldn't live in that silence," she said. "He never spoke, just worked. I felt like a ghost." Trace returned to Elijah with a letter from her. The man read it slowly, then burned it in the fire. "She's right," he said. "I didn't know how to love her." That night, Trace and Pete camped under the stars. Trace stared into the flames, Becky's name on his lips. Pete curled close, a silent sentinel against the dark. Chapter 8. The Widow's Gambit. The letter came from a cattleman named Royce McKinnon. His bride, a supposed widow named Evelyn, had vanished with his inheritance, $800 in gold, and a deed to a parcel of land near the Missouri. "She said she lost her husband in the war," Royce wrote. "Turns out she's lost a lot of husbands." Trace and Pete followed her trail to the riverboats of St. Joseph, where gamblers and grifters plied their trade in velvet and smoke. Evelyn was there, dealing cards at a table full of fools and fortune-seekers. She wore a green dress and a smile that could melt iron. Pete found her first, the dog slipping through the crowd like a shadow. He sat at her feet, tail still, eyes locked. Evelyn looked down and sighed. "Well, hell, I was hoping I'd never see you two." Trace stepped forward. "You've been busy." She dealt another hand. "A girl's got to eat." "You took a man's future." She paused, then gathered the cards. "I took what I was offered. Royce wanted a wife. I gave him a story." Trace didn't raise his voice. "He wants his money." She reached into her bodice and pulled out a pouch. "Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him I'm tired." Trace took the gold. "You could have been more." She laughed, but there was no joy in it. "The world's been tired of women like me a lot longer than I've been tired of it." He watched her walk away, hips swaying, head high. Pete didn't move until she was gone. They left the riverboat that night, the sound of an off-key piano fading behind them. Trace didn't look back. Chapter 9. Shadows of the Past. The wind howled across the plains, carrying with it the scent of sage and memory. Trace and Pete camped near a dry creek bed, the fire crackling low. Trace held a photograph in his hand, Becky smiling in a schoolyard, chalk dust on her skirt. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in years. She liked lilacs, he said to Pete. Used to tuck them behind her ear. Pete rested his head on Trace's knee. She wanted to teach out here. Said the frontier needed books as much as bullets. Trace stared into the flames. She caught fever in the spring. I was away on a job. By the time I got back, he didn't finish. Pete whined softly, a sound of shared sorrow. Trace pulled a letter from his coat. It was old, the ink faded. Becky's handwriting, neat and hopeful. "I'll be waiting," it said. "Come home soon." He folded it carefully and placed it back in his pocket. "You're the only one who stayed," he whispered to Pete. The dog thumped his tail once, then curled closer. That night, Trace dreamed of a wedding that never was. Becky in white, Pete as the ring-bearer, the prairie blooming with wildflowers. When he woke, the fire was out, but the sky was full of stars. Chapter 10. The Last Bounty. The letter came in a pale blue envelope, the handwriting delicate and unsure. It wasn't from a husband, but from a bride. "My name is Eliza," it read. "I don't want to be found. I want to be free. They say you help people like me. Please, if you're real, come." Trace read it twice, then handed it to Pete. The dog sniffed it, then looked up, ears alert. They rode west into the Rockies, where the air grew thin and the trails turned to whispers. Snow fell early that year, blanketing the world in silence. Trace wrapped his coat tighter. Pete's breath came in clouds. Eliza's trail was faint, broken twigs, a scrap of fabric caught on a branch, a half-buried boot print in the snow. But Pete followed it with unerring focus, nose to the wind. They found her in a cabin tucked into a pine hollow, smoke curling from the chimney. She opened the door with a rifle in her hands and fear in her eyes. "You're him," she said. Trace nodded. "I got your letter." She lowered the rifle. "He's coming. My husband. He hired men." Trace stepped inside. The cabin was small but warm. A kettle hissed on the stove. Eliza looked young, too young for the scars on her wrists. "I didn't steal anything," she said. "Just my life." Trace didn't ask questions. He just checked the windows, loaded his rifle, and waited. The men came at dawn, 3 of them, rough and loud. Trace met them outside. Pete flanked left. The fight was quick and brutal. One man fled. One bled into the snow. The third begged for mercy. Trace let him crawl away. Inside, Eliza wept. "I thought I'd have to run forever." Trace handed her a train ticket. "You don't. Not anymore." Pete licked her hand. She smiled through her tears. They rode with her to the station. As the train pulled away, Eliza waved from the window. Trace tipped his hat. Pete barked once. It was the first time Trace had taken a bounty not to return a woman, but to set her free. Chapter 11. The Changing West. The West was changing. The wild places were shrinking, fenced in by railroads and telegraph lines. Towns rose where once there was only prairie. The saloons got quieter. The letters came less often. Trace and Pete slowed their pace. They took fewer jobs, spent more nights under the stars and fewer in the saddle. The world was moving on, and they were becoming part of its stories rather than its future. In one town, a boy approached them with wide eyes. "Are you the bride hunter? The one who finds runaway brides?" Trace nodded. The boy grinned. "My name is George. My pa says you're a legend." Trace smiled, but it didn't come from his heart. Legends are just stories people tell when they forget the truth. "Regardless, sir, that's what I want to be when I grow up, a bride hunter." "Careful, George, for what you wish for," Trace said, 1,000 regrets flooding him all at once. They stayed in that town for a week. Trace helped George's father mend a fence. Pete herded chickens. It felt almost like peace. One morning, Trace found a letter tucked under his saddle. No name, just a note. "Thank you for giving me back my life." He folded it carefully and placed it with the others. Chapter 12. Man and His Dog. Years went by. The lines on Trace's face deepened. Pete's muzzle turned gray, but they still rode together, two shadows against the setting sun. One autumn, Trace returned to the place where he'd buried Becky. A cottonwood tree had grown beside her grave, its leaves gold and trembling. He dug a second grave beside hers. Not for himself. He wasn't ready yet, but for Pete when the time came. It was nearing. "I figure you'd want to be close," he said, scratching the dog's ears. Pete wagged his tail, eyes bright. They camped there that night. Trace told stories of brides and gamblers, of riverboats and redemption. Pete listened as he always had. When the time came, it was quiet. Pete lay down beside the fire and didn't wake up. Trace buried him beneath the cottonwood, beside Becky. He carved a simple marker. Pete, a true friend. Chapter 13. The Letter. He never answered. Among the many letters Trace had received over the years, one remained unopened for a long time. It was written in a careful, looping hand and sealed with a pressed violet. The return address was from a small town in Missouri. The name on the envelope, Tessa May Whitmore. Trace had met Tessa May once, years ago, before Becky. She was a school teacher, too, sharp-witted, kind-eyed, and brave in a quiet way. They'd shared a dance at a town social a few letters after. Then life, as it often did, pulled them in different directions. He finally opened the letter one cold evening, long after Pete's grave had settled beneath the cottonwood. "Dear Trace, I don't know if you remember me. I heard about what you do now, how you help people. I always knew you would. I'm not writing to ask for help. I just wanted to say thank you. For the dance, for the way you looked at me like I mattered. If you ever pass through Willow Creek, there's a chair on my porch, and a pot of coffee waiting. Yours, Tessa May." Trace folded the letter and placed it in his coat pocket, next to Becky's. He never made it to Willow Creek, but he thought about it often, about the porch, the coffee, the possibility of something gentle. Chapter 14. The Bride Who Stayed. The letter came from Vernon Tate, a rancher with a sharp tongue and a reputation for cruelty. He claimed his bride, Miriam, had refused to fulfill her wifely duties and was squatting on his land. "She won't leave," the letter read. "She's my property by law, to do with as I please. I want her gone." Trace didn't like the tone, but he rode out anyway. Miriam met him at the gate of the ranch house. She was calm, composed, and carried a shotgun across her lap. "I'm not running," she said. "I'm surviving." She told her story over tea. Vernon had promised her a home, then treated her like a servant. When she refused his advances, he rode off screaming of vengeance. She'd been living in the house ever since. Trace listened. An old yellow barnyard cat sat at her feet, tail still. "You gonna make me take him back?" she asked. Trace shook his head. "No, ma'am. He wants you gone. But you stay right here and I'm gonna make sure he doesn't bother you again." "What are you going to do?" she asked worriedly. "I'll have a little talk with him," he said. That night, Trace confronted Vernon in town. The man spat and reached for the gun in his belt. He was as slow as tomorrow. Trace drew like lightning and put a notch in each of the man's ears. As Vernon cried in pain, Trace made him sign over the ranch's deed to Miriam. The sheriff called it self-defense. As men laughed and pointed, Vernon left town with bloody bandages plastered to each ear and a face red with embarrassment. Miriam stayed. She turned the ranch into a boarding house for women with nowhere else to go. Trace tipped his hat as he rode away. In his memory, Pete barked once, approving. Chapter 15. The Man Who Hunted Brides. His name was Drake Calder. He wore a black duster and drove a caged wagon containing 3 battered and beaten women. Their only clothing, tattered rags and the rusted shackles around their ankles. Trace met him in a saloon outside Laramie. Calder was boasting about his latest catch, a blonde woman he'd dragged back to her husband in chains. "She cried the whole way, offering me things her husband never got," he said, grinning. "But a job's a job." Trace stood slowly. "You ever think maybe you're in the wrong line of business, Calder?" Calder laughed. "You go soft, Trace." Trace didn't answer. He just motioned and walked outside. Calder followed. The fight was short, brutal. When it was over, Calder lay in the dust. Both his hands were busted along with his face. His shackles were twisted around his neck, just barely letting him breathe through broken teeth. Trace left him there and went to the blacksmith's forge for a borrowed hammer. He then broke the lock on the caged wagon, set the women loose from their restraints, and gave them money for train fare to freedom. Some jobs weren't worth doing. Trace retired that day and disappeared into the legends of the past. Epilogue. The Rider and the Wind. Many years later, the wind still moves across the plains, stirring dust and memory. In some towns, they still speak of the man called Trace and the dog with the mismatched eyes. They say he never raised his voice, never drew his gun unless he had to. They say he could read a lie in a heartbeat and mercy in a whisper. A new rider passes through those same towns now. Younger, quicker, but with the same quiet eyes. He carries a journal in his saddlebag. Trace's journal. He reads it by firelight, learning not just how to track, but how to listen. His name is George. He stops by the cottonwood tree sometimes. Leaves rustle like old stories. 2 graves rest beneath it. One for the woman Trace loved, one for a dog who never left. And the rider tips his hat every time, because legends don't die, they ride the wind. The end.